Hi, I'm DM Gallibond, and last week at the table we look at what happened in the two actual play games I run on my Twitch channel, http twitch.tv/Gallibond. I took a week off last week due to scheduled convention travel, so I'll catch you up on the last 2 weeks in both my games. Let's get on with the show. On Thursday night we are playing the Essentials game at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We had a full cast on Thursday night as all our players showed up. Wes playing Gorham, Vernon playing Finn, James with a Benedom, Michael with Dorzafir, Ivy with Hyza, and Chris playing L were all in attendance. Back in session 8, we began by questioning the orcs that had been put to sleep at the end of the previous session. Gorham wanted to murder the orcs right away, but the others, led mostly by Hyza, were willing to give the orcs a chance to live. They found out that these orcs had come from Icespire Hold and had been driven out by the White Dragon. They were the orcs were frustrated that too many dwarves, elves, and humans had moved into what they consider orc lands, and so they decided they would go live with humans. They had come to the ranch demanding that the farmer and his ranch hands let them live there with them, and they were attacked. They fought back and some of the ranch hands died, but they tied up the farmer and put him in the cellar where they are feeding him bread and water until he relents and allows the orcs to stay there with him. Meanwhile, the orcs have been keeping a very tidy house. As the party explored both upstairs and downstairs, they found only one room where everything was messy, and that appeared to be the old retired sheriff's business office. Otherwise, everything was neat, tidy, organized, and cleaned except for the few plates, cups, and napkins that had fallen when the orcs rushed to defend the farm from the invading PCs. Now, as they explained to the party, the orcs were deciding they were going to choose their leader from among who kept the most tidy house. So they were all competing to see who could be the neatest. Not exactly what you'd normally expect from orcs, but that is what it is. So the party found Big Al, the old sheriff, and he was alive, a bit weak and chafed from having been tied up for so long and fed only bread and water, but he was otherwise hurt and down in a cellar right where the orcs said they would find him. The party untied him, and the first things he asked about were his ranch hands and his cow named Petunia. Now, Petunia produces the milk the sheriff uses to mold his skull-shaped butter sculptures, and he seemed to care more about her than just about anything. As for the orcs, he talked to them and learned from the party that most of the ranch hands, save one that had escaped to Phandalin, seemed to be dead. He also had a sympathetic ear for the plight of the orcs. As a sheriff in these parts, he had long known Icespire Hold to be a home for the orcs, and he considered any humans or elves or dwarves to go that way and get themselves killed to be damned fools for walking into an orc den. The orcs from the Hold had never raided towns in the territory that the sheriff had patrolled, and he had never sent or condoned adventurers going into their lair looking for trouble. In the end, the party found Petunia and returned her. They also accepted the sheriff's decision that the last two orcs should be left alive and would stay with him at the ranch to begin learning the ways of being a farmer. They would also undertake the job of burying the dead ranch hands and burning the orcs in a funeral pyre, and then learning how to scatter the ashes of the orcs as fertilizer on the crops. Now, the dwarf and a couple of others were doubtful of this idea. However, the party opted to trust the old sheriff to know what he was doing and let him get himself killed if that was going to happen anyway. They did ask Big Al to give them a message to take back to Phandalin, and he wrote out a letter asking the town master to send a detachment of town militia. They should come check on the farm and help in rebuilding the barn and the forge. If they found anything amiss, they would be permitted to slay the orcs and bury the sheriff, but if everyone is alive, they should take word to the nearby settlements that the orcs from Butterskull Ranch are allies of Big Al and should not be harmed without provocation. So the party returned to Phandalin to collect their payment, and then they escorted Don John Raskin to the Mountain Toe gold mine. Along the way, they found more orcs. This time, the orcs were dead, and it looked like these orcs had died terrified. A few medicine checks later, the party determined that they and the surrounding vegetation had all been subjected to a blast of super cold icy wind or breath that had slain them several days previously. Otherwise, the orcs bore no injury. The party all agreed the dragon could have killed the orcs, but there was no evidence of any claw or bite marks, so it could not be certain. After all, they understand, other monsters and powerful wizards can also attack enemies with similar blasts from spells or their natural abilities. So they reached the mine and they were met by two nervous looking guards, female guards at that, who seemed friendly enough towards Don John but were a bit concerned about his armed escort. And that's where we wound up leaving that session. So then in session 9, we picked up with Don John Raskin and the party heading into the mine. They found all the miners that are present were female humans. This is a bit unusual, and they also claim to have an overseer already, a woman named Zelene Vernaster. Don John was confused because he had been told the previous overseer was a dwarf named Orhammer. Some of the party noticed a tension in the miners at this, but Zelene had an answer ready. She got all teary-eyed, and she told Don John that the truth is there had been a cave-in deeper in the mine. Master Orhammer and many of the other dwarven miners had been trapped and died. These humans with her are all that are left. They, of course, will welcome Master Raskin and his strong leadership. At that, some of the women began fawning over and flirting with Don John, and he was quite pleased with himself. And he began telling the PCs that, well, according to old Don John, I don't think y'all be needing to stay around here much longer. You can head on back to Phandalin. Old Don John Raskin, he's got the situation under control. Uh, Now, the party were very suspicious, and they had a rather humorous and kind of bumbling conversation about needing to go outside and get some gifts for the miners. All of the party, by their roles, knew something was wrong, but they couldn't decide what to do about it. Eventually, Don John came out of the mine, followed by some of the miners, and when the party still delayed their preparations to leave, one of the miners got impatient and stabbed Don John in the back with a short sword, and the fight was on. So the rest of the session was one big fight that saw a couple of PCs get badly injured and saw Don John wail in terror every time his turn came around, screaming about being left to die. Now, truth is, he barely had a flesh wound, but he didn't lift a finger to join the fight, so the party soon got tired of his foolishness and just started ignoring him. Now, the unusual thing they noticed is that when each of the human, in air quotes, miners was killed, as she fell, her form reverted into some kind of humanoid rat monster. The fight was just winding down as we finished, so nobody has tried to figure out just what these creatures are yet. So in the next session, we'll pick up with the aftermath of the battle and find out what's really going on in the mine, and the PCs should have a chance to level up at our break in the session. So tune in Thursday night at 8 p.m. to find out what happens. Now, I'm going to mention the history of D&D, which was the game I had on Saturday. It has now been put on indefinite hiatus. For the second week in a row, we had only one player show up as of February 29th, and we've had to skip too many weeks overall since we started the game due to attendance for me to consider the game to be viable. So as I told the players, as the DM, I take responsibility for the game not not really being able to get going consistently. I honestly launched it as a bit of an experiment, one that I have long wanted to try, and it was a valuable learning experience. Now it seems that in order to have a game work with the old rules, the original D&D rules that I had been using, I'm going to need to spend not just one, but many sessions with the players where we're not playing full sessions, but I'm just simply orienting them to the limitations of that edition and the way that the rules work. I'm going to have to give people a chance to come in, kick the tires, figure out whether this is a rule set they really like before we really get into figuring out who is going to be in the game and who's going to have enough interest in these old rules to play a full campaign. So uh, it just seems to me like most of the players on Roll20 are kind of clueless about just how different the old editions of the game were from what they're used to today, and they're simply unwilling to do some of the hard mental work required to wrap their brains around a system that is different from what they've played before. Some longtime players have nostalgia for the old system, but the new one is so well refined that the older systems really do feel rough and raw by comparison. So there's a lot more judgment calls that need to be made, and the pace of the game is a bit slower as a result. Uh, so it's like there's a reason back in the day that we had 9, 12-hour D&D sessions, and we would get done as much in those 12 hours as you can get done in a 3-hour session of, uh, of 5th edition D&D. It's because the rules just took a lot longer to figure out, well, okay, how is this really going to work? Uh, so I'm going to have a think and research with some other DMs online about how they run games in the very old editions to try to help make the game more accessible to new players and still be able to have my world building game work as I intended. So if you had gotten used to seeing the Saturday game on Twitch, that game is not going to be there for a while. So on Sundays at 2:30 p.m. we play the Walker of Waterdeep. Now that's a 5e game where we cross the streams of lore between D&D 5e and Magic the Gathering. This week, or the previous week, last week I should say, was session 39, and the party started session in the middle of their battle at the Boros Legion training arena. During that battle, Oyahusa was knocked unconscious and would have been out of the fight if not for the intervention of Aurora, his new sentient magical item. It cast Cure Wounds on him and told him to get back into combat, indicating that it cannot do that again until the next dawn. The party eventually prevailed, taking down all 6 of their Boros Legion opponents. However, everyone was injured, and most of the party stayed to talk to the Boros at the end of the fight to, sort of talk a little bit about their strategies and what the Boros saw and, any kind of military pointers that they might have. But Thardrum was annoyed with having to fight the Boros and stormed off back to his quarters in a very annoyed dwarven sort of way. So the party was reminded that the next day they would begin meeting with representatives of each of the 9 guilds, but the PCs were not content to sit around and wait. They decided to split up and go exploring the city, which was condoned by their hosts as long as they took guides with them. So Adamant and Thardrum went to visit the Scholarly Quarter independently. That's over in Precinct 5. Thardrum was inquiring about portals, and Adamant went to visit a couple of the different laboratories of the Izzet League. So for the rest of the session, the party had separate adventures. Our Barbarians player was unable to attend the session due to a family move, so he just retired to the diplomatic quarters that the party had been assigned and waited out the session. Adamant was interested in finding out more about the Izzet League, so he had a guide take him to Precinct 5, where some of the laboratories are located in the blister coils. And Thardrum was interested in learning more about the planar travel and planar mechanics, so he also went to Precinct 5, where he inquired about enrolling in the Prism University. Now, Xandri wanted to get free of her government minders, and thinking that Oyahusa was likely her most willing accomplice, and quite frankly, he was the one most likely to see her trying to sneak out and raise an alarm, she approached him about her plan. Now he agreed to go with her, and using their magical flight and levitation abilities, they decided to take the window out, or to leap out the window and float down to the ground below once night fell. So over at the Blister Coils, Adamant made fast friends with the goblins and the gnomes in the Izzet League, and he quickly managed to tinker with some components that are being developed for a new mode of flight that the Izzet League are researching called rocketry. The upshot was that he learned the Izzet are very particular about anyone using tools other than their own, so the most significant thing Adamant did was use his forge magic abilities to create replicas of the Izzet tools that are better suited for his Warforged larger, thicker fingers. Now, over at the Prism University, Thardrum learned that in Ravnica, even the centers of higher learning have a bureaucracy. After talking to an intern at the Student Center, he was sent to a functionary in the admissions office who referred him to an enrollment counselor who would review his credentials and see about his intended course of study. Now, after Thardrum explained several times, he finally found someone that realized he's actually a visiting dignitary from another world, and that makes him kind of a big deal. So they found a lecture day and time that would work with Thardrum's schedule and got him signed up to audit a class in portal mechanics. So then they began discussing with him the possibility that Thardrum might participate in the visiting lecturer series with the Department of Cultural Studies. Now, they always like to have visitors to Ravnica give lectures about their home worlds and their people, and they would especially be interested in hearing from Thardrum since dwarves are not common and not native to Ravnica. So then there is the unauthorized night on the town. Free of their government minders, Xandri and Oyo set out to explore the city, but they noticed a large insect up on a building that seems to be watching them. They found a piano bar and ducked inside, where they met a cast of characters, including a bartender, a sauced government worker, a spurned elf woman, a loxodon in the flesh, and a swanky, talented, and slightly provocative elf pianist. So that was pretty much where we left the session 39. Now in session 40 this week, the party was still split up. So our barbarians player, Gallibond the half-orc, he was back, so he went on his own to spar with the Boros one-on-one at a training center, where he managed to win and lose a couple of matches. And those matches that he fought in the one-on-one style were the winner was determined by the first 1 to 3 strikes. And Thardrum's player was unable to be there for most of the session, so he was pretty much out of it all day. Over in the bar, Xandri and Oyahusa pretty much dominated the action of the evening. They pried information out of the Sauce tax accountant, which wasn't difficult because he was in a salty mood and he was happy to get all his frustrations with his job off his chest. Now, the spurned elf woman had been fired from her job by a senator boss who was bribed by a big-time donor who brought a younger, dumber, and slightly sluttier replacement that would not only take a position in the office, but would also take any position the senator might want in his bed. So, from the sauced human at the bar, they learned a little bit about the corruption and the shady dealings going on in New Prov. And he talked all about the Orzhov Syndicate and how they are funding the building of ghost cities in some districts that don't have nearly enough population to fill them. And he also complained about the level of military spending, and he swears that most of the guilds are trying to find a way to hide money from their tax assessments, but he just hasn't quite been able to put the proof together about it yet. So he also complained about the guild pact, and through further questions, Oyahusa learned that the pact between the guilds was now embodied in a person, a powerful wizard named Jace, who concerns the leadership of all the guilds by his habit of simply vanishing from Ravnica for weeks or months at a time, and then returning unnoticed, or returning unannounced. So after seeing a few glares from the spurned elf woman, Xandri's curiosity got the better of her, and she moved over to sit next to the elf and the Loxodon, who also turned out to be a female. Now, because of what had happened with her job earlier in the day, the elf was quite understandably very angry at her boss, and by extension with most men at the moment. So Xandri attempted some mild flirting, but the woman was just in a mood to be angry. So Xandri switched tactics and engaged a woman in arm wrestling, putting up a show of an effort but letting the spurned elf win in the end. Just as the woman was starting to feel a little better, Oyahusa decided it was time to bring a bottle of champagne and the drunken guy over to interact with the ladies. So our dear drunken human friend slid onto a chair next to the spurned elf woman, and with his breath full of booze proceeded to slur his words as he told her just how beautiful her eyes were. The result was that the spurned elf woman smashed an entire glass of champagne into the man's face, slicing open his cheeks and knocking him off his chair to the floor below before she stormed out of the bar by herself. Now, that pretty much signaled to Oyahusa and Xandri that it was probably time to leave, and Xandri quickly applied a lay on hands to heal the drunken man's wounds. And as they left the bar, they saw another one of those large insect creatures watching them from the side of a building above. While they were watching that, a cutpurse made a clumsy and unsuccessful attempt to pick Xandri's pocket, and the two of them followed that cutpurse to an alley. And when they looked around the edge of the alley, they saw that the cutpurse was heading into a door about 20 feet away. So they started moving towards the door, and when they did, both ends of the alley were closed off by walls of skeletal remains that seemed to just emerge out of the buildings on either side of the alley and cut off the exit on either end. And after those walls appeared, uh, two humanoid figures stepped from the shadows, while one of those ever-watching insects perched on a roof high above the alley. So a woman who appeared to be a half-elf stepped forward and spoke to the two heroes. Her smile revealed elongated canine teeth, and when she took a swig from a wineskin, the liquid she licked off her lower lip looked like blood. So she introduced herself as an agent of House Demir, and she said that her group had very much wanted to meet the visitors from Toril for some time. She knew their names, and she knew that they had been led to believe that House Demir no longer existed. Her companion introduced himself as a law mage of the Azoria Senate, and the Demir agent said that it served her guild for everyone to believe that that's exactly what he is. Secrets are the trade of the Demir, and using secrets to their best advantage is their greatest power. She seemed to know that this would intrigue them both, but the whole undead situation made Xandri extremely nervous. I have to say that Oyahusa was very intrigued by the operations of this House Demir, just as his player thought he might be when we started the campaign. So the two learned something about the Demir, at least from the perspective of the Demir themselves, and Oyahusa was told that he would have an opportunity to speak again to Demiri agents when he saw their sign, which they showed him through prestidigitation, drawing it glowing in the air between them. The agent also assured them that their spy bugs are unerring trackers, and they always know the location of their quarry if they are on the same plane. So after giving a few vague answers to the questions the two heroes had, the figures melted back into the shadows, and the walls at either end of the alley parted, allowing Xandri and Oyahusa to leave unharmed, at least unharmed physically. So the session ended the following morning when Chandler Duran showed up at the ambassador's quarters. He said that he had been assigned to take them to meet the guild representatives in New Prov. They would meet with 3 guilds today, which Chandler assured them was going to take most of the day because they would want to pepper visitors with questions about their homeworld. So he expressed concern that his guild, the Boros Legion, were arming themselves to the teeth, and he said that the periodic disappearance of the living guild pack made that even more worrisome. So Xandri let slip the name Jace, not realizing that she had heard that name from someone else, and this drew Chandler's sharp question, "Where did you hear that name?" So we closed the session with Xandri fumbling for an answer, which she will have to give next week when we start. You can join us next Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern to see what happens next. And that's last week at the table for March 10th. Tune in on Twitch on Thursdays and Sundays to see what happens in the live games, or keep posted here to find out what happened last week at our table. Remember always to try to make your games memorable so you can have tales from your table to share with your friends as well. Good night, everybody.